There was a time I thought we were the couple people envied. You know the kind, when you walk into a room and people say, "Look at those two." That was us. Me, a loud, affectionate Italian-American kid from Queens with a big family and even bigger Sunday dinners. Her. A bright-eyed Irish girl from Massachusetts with a soft laugh and a fierce heart. We met at a music festival in upstate New York, me there with my cousins, her with her college roommate. We locked eyes during a Stevie Wonder cover and ended up dancing under the stars. Cliché. Yeah. But it was real. The kind of real you only get once. We talked until the sun came up, and I swear, I fell in love with her right then and there, while she was shivering in my hoodie, sipping gas station coffee, and telling me about how she used to pretend to be a journalist when she was a kid. Our first few years together felt like flying. She was sharp and gentle in all the ways I wasn't. I was bold and messy in all the ways she needed. We balanced each other. We built routines, inside jokes, rituals. We had a little apartment in Astoria with creaky floors and a leaky radiator, but it was home. We'd fall asleep to the hum of the city and wake up to the smell of garlic or burnt toast, depending on who got up first. She learned how to make my nana's meatballs. I learned to love Barry's tea. That's how deep it went. But it wasn't all smooth. My family, well, they're old school. Loud, tight-knit, opinionated. And they never really accepted her. Not truly. I think they expected me to marry someone who spoke Italian and made sauce from scratch. Instead, I married a woman who drank Guinness and couldn't tell oregano from basil. But she loved me. She loved me. And that should have been enough for them. It wasn't. My ma was the worst about it, always making comments that sounded polite but landed like daggers. "Oh, honey, do you need help setting the table? We do it a certain way, you know." And my uncles barely acknowledged her, just gave her tight smiles and turned their backs. Even my sister would whisper things to my cousins that I wasn't supposed to hear. But I did. It hurt her more than she let on. She tried to laugh it off, tried to bond with them, tried to learn Italian phrases and get my mom's recipes right. But I saw it chip away at her, little by little. Still, she never made me choose. Not once. When we lost our son during childbirth, God, even writing that hurts, it was like the whole world dropped out from under us. He was supposed to be our fresh start. The thing that would quiet the noise and bring both sides together. My family would finally see what she was made of. And her family, they'd already loved me like their own. But he didn't make it. And neither did we. Not really. We didn't fall apart overnight. We tried. Therapy. Walks. Dinners we couldn't eat. Sleep we couldn't find. We held each other until our arms went numb. We cried in the middle of TV shows. We fought about nothing just to feel something. We kept saying, "We'll get through this." But something shifted. Something cracked in the foundation we built with such care. Still, if you had asked me back then if she'd ever cheat on me, I would have said never. Not her. Not the woman who looked at me like I hung the moon. Not the woman who buried her face in my chest the day we lost our son and whispered, "I don't know how to do this without you." But here we are. And now I'm trying to remember when things started to change. Trying to figure out how the girl who once danced barefoot in our kitchen ended up lying to my face. Because I think it's important you understand, this didn't start as a tragedy. It started as a love story. Grief changes people. That's something people say all the time, like it's just some line to toss out at funerals or over awkward coffee visits. But they never really explain how. They don't tell you how it burrows deep into your home and builds a nest there. They don't tell you how it can turn the person you love into a stranger, slowly, so slowly you don't even realize it's happening until you're both just ghosts living in the same house. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the cards and the well-meaning advice from people who had no clue what we were going through, we were alone. Just us and the silence. The kind that hums at 3 a.m. and reminds you that you should be hearing your child cry, but you're not. I started going back to work after 2 weeks. She didn't. Couldn't. I didn't push. Honestly, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to help. She'd sit on the couch in her bathrobe, watching the same nature documentaries over and over. I'd come home to an untouched dinner and a wife who barely looked up when I walked in the door. We went to counseling, sometimes together, sometimes separate. We both said the right things, how we were committed to healing, how we wanted to find our way back. And I believe we did. At least, I wanted to. But it felt like we were playing roles, like actors reciting lines we hoped would lead to a different ending. My family was no help. They barely mentioned the baby. It was like silence was their way of coping, or maybe avoidance was just easier than facing the pain. My ma would still nitpick, ask why my wife wasn't pulling herself together yet, whisper comments like, "In our day, women didn't fall apart like this." We just kept going. It made my blood boil. But I didn't argue. I didn't defend her like I should have. I think, deep down, I was already tired. Not of her. Just, everything. Grief wears you down like waves on a rock. You think you're strong, and then one day, you're nothing but sand. She started going on long walks in the evenings. Said the fresh air helped. I encouraged it. I thought maybe it was a good sign, maybe she was trying to reconnect with the world again. But she didn't tell me where she went. And I didn't ask. That's the thing. It wasn't just what changed, it was what we stopped doing. We stopped asking. Stopped checking in. Stopped holding hands without thinking about it. Our conversations became transactional. Groceries. Bills. Appointments. We became roommates who shared a wound instead of a life. There were still moments, though. Fleeting ones. Like when I caught her humming in the kitchen one morning, stirring coffee, her hair messy, wearing my old college hoodie. I almost said something. Almost walked up behind her and kissed her neck the way I used to. But I hesitated, and the moment passed. Then there was the time I came home and found her sitting in our son's unfinished nursery. She didn't hear me walk in. She was holding the tiny blanket my sister had knit for the baby and just staring out the window. Not crying. Not moving. Just staring. I stood there in the hallway and watched her for a full minute before backing away, like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I'd intruded on something private. And maybe I had. We were both breaking in our own quiet ways. And instead of reaching for each other, we built our own little islands. I started working later. Told myself it was to catch up on projects, but really, the office felt safer than home. She started going to yoga classes. Then group therapy. Then a book club that met on Thursday nights. I never met the people from those groups. She never invited me to. Still, I didn't think anything of it. Not really. Not yet. Because even when things are falling apart, you want to believe they're not. You cling to the idea that this is just a phase. That love is enough to fix it. That the person you married, the person who once made your heart race just by walking into a room, could never lie to you. But love is funny like that. It can blind you just as much as it can save you. I still don't know exactly when I started to feel like I was being erased. It wasn't a sudden thing. There was no big fight, no screaming match, no slammed doors. It was more like, one day I realized I couldn't remember the last time she looked me in the eyes for longer than a few seconds. Or the last time she reached for my hand first. It was in the little things. The way she'd flinch, barely, but enough to notice, when I brushed her arm. The way her phone was always face down. The quiet way she'd smile at nothing while texting, a smile that wasn't for me. I know how that sounds. Paranoid. Insecure. Maybe I was. Maybe grief just makes you suspicious of everything, even love. But it wasn't just in my head. Something had shifted. She'd gotten close to this guy from her grief support group. His name was Liam. I remember it clearly now, because she'd mentioned him in passing one night at dinner, like it was nothing. Liam told this funny story about dropping his coffee all over his therapist's rug. I laughed. She laughed. And we moved on. But then Liam's name kept coming up. A little too often. Liam said this, Liam texted me that, Liam showed me this song. At first, I tried to be mature about it. I mean, they were in a group meant to help people cope with loss. Maybe he understood her in a way I couldn't. Maybe it was easier to talk to someone who wasn't part of the tragedy. Who didn't look like a walking reminder of everything she lost. But deep down, I hated him. Not because I thought she was cheating, not yet, but because I could feel myself being replaced. Emotionally. Slowly. Like I was fading from her world, and she didn't even notice. One night I asked, "Do you ever talk to anyone from your group outside of meetings?" She blinked. "A few of them, yeah." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just wondering." That's how weak I'd gotten. I couldn't even ask the real question. She started spending more nights out. The book club, the yoga, the occasional dinner with friends from therapy. Sometimes she'd come home and I could smell whiskey on her breath, something she used to avoid. She'd climb into bed without saying much and turn her back to me. And I'd lay there, wide awake, listening to her breathe. We didn't fight. Not really. There was too much silence between us for that. But one night, it broke. She came home late again, past midnight. Said she'd lost track of time after dinner with the group. I said, I was worried. She rolled her eyes. "I'm an adult, you know. You don't have to babysit me." That stung. "I'm not babysitting. I just miss you." She looked at me like she didn't understand the words. "I'm here." "No, you're not," I said. "You haven't been for a long time." That's when the silence turned heavy. She sat down, pulled off her boots slowly. Her voice was low when she said, "I don't know how to be anything right now. I don't know how to be a wife. Or a woman who laughs. Or someone who makes pancakes on Sunday mornings. I'm just trying to breathe. That's all." And I believed her. That's the thing. I didn't think she was being cruel. I think she was just lost. Maybe we both were. But something inside me whispered that this wasn't just about grief anymore. This was about something breaking between us, a bond we thought was unbreakable. And neither of us knew how to stop it. We tried again after that, therapy, date nights, walks through Central Park like we used to. For a little while, it felt like maybe we were finding our way back. She held my hand during a movie. We made dinner together and laughed when the sauce burned. We made love once, slowly, like two people trying to remember how. But then it was gone again. Like fog in the morning. And the distance returned, colder than before. And Liam's name? It started coming up less. But only because she stopped talking about him entirely. It was a Wednesday when it first really hit me. She left her laptop open on the dining table. Something she rarely did. She was in the shower, humming a song I didn't recognize, one of those quiet, wordless hums that somehow sounded like she was somewhere far away. I wasn't looking for anything. I swear to you, I wasn't. But there was a notification in the corner of the screen. A message preview. Not from Liam, but someone named Connor. "Last night was amazing. Still thinking about the way you laughed when I dropped the wine." My stomach dropped. I told myself it was probably innocent. A coworker. A classmate. Something. But then I clicked, just once, and the message thread opened. There weren't a lot of texts. Just enough to see the tone. The kind of casual intimacy you don't fake. Inside jokes. Flirty emojis. One photo of her smiling at a restaurant I didn't recognize, in a dress I'd never seen before. She looked beautiful. Radiant, even. And not once had she looked at me like that in months. I closed the laptop gently. Sat there, staring at the table, trying to slow my breathing. She came out of the shower wearing my t-shirt. Hair damp, skin pink from the heat. She gave me a half smile. "What are you doing just sitting there?" I said, "Just tired." She kissed my forehead and went to the bedroom. And I sat there, heart pounding, thinking, this can't be happening. It wasn't Liam. It was someone else. And yet. I didn't say anything. Not that night. Not the next. I don't know if it was cowardice or hope. Maybe both. I kept waiting for her to confess, for her to slip up, for something to make it undeniable. But she didn't. She just kept living like nothing was wrong. And I kept playing my part, the supportive husband, the quiet provider, the man who forgives before he even knows what to forgive. I tried telling myself it was an emotional thing. That maybe she was just talking to someone. That maybe it wasn't physical. But I knew better. You know when someone's body changes. Not just physically, but in how they move. How they hold themselves. She was different. Lighter. Like someone who just opened a door and walked into a room full of fresh air. One night we were sitting on the couch watching a show she used to love. She laughed at a scene, genuinely, for the first time in ages, and I remember thinking, I wish I was the reason for that laugh. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying everything. The long walks. The group dinners. The Thursday night book club that seemed to run later and later. The girls' weekend she took upstate with no photos, no details. I think, in a way, I knew even before the messages. My gut had known for weeks. But hearts are stubborn. They'll break themselves into pieces just to avoid letting go. I talked to my sister about it. First time I told anyone. She's going through something, I said. But I think there's someone else. My sister got quiet. She always liked my wife, but she wasn't blind. You want to know, or do you want to stay married? She asked. I don't know, I said. Maybe both. She gave me that look only sisters can give, the kind that cuts through all the lies you tell yourself. Well, you can't have both. Not like this. And she was right. So I started watching more closely. Not to catch her in the act, but to understand. To see the whole picture. I stopped making excuses. I let myself feel it, the distance, the deception, the weight of pretending everything was fine. The day I saw her walking down our block with a man I didn't know, laughing, brushing her hand against his arm, looking up at him like he was the only person in the world, I stopped pretending. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. I stood there on the corner, grocery bag in hand, frozen. They turned the corner. And just like that, my heart didn't break. It cracked. Quietly. Cleanly. Like glass under pressure. I didn't follow them. I wish I could say I did. That I ran after them, confronted her on the street, demanded answers right there on the sidewalk like a man who finally realized he had nothing left to lose. But I didn't. I turned around. Walked 2 blocks in the opposite direction. Stood in front of some closed cafe and stared at the flickering neon sign until it gave up and blinked out completely. I don't even know how long I stood there. At some point I realized my hands were shaking so badly the grocery bag had ripped open and a head of garlic was rolling down the curb. It was stupid, but that garlic, rolling away like even it couldn't stand to be near me, somehow made me laugh. And then cry. Just like that. In the middle of the city, with a bottle of olive oil in one hand and my soul unraveling in the other. I didn't sleep that night. I waited until she was asleep, then sat in the living room in the dark. I wanted to go through her phone. Her purse. Her drawers. But I didn't. I didn't want evidence. I already had everything I needed. The next day, I asked her about Connor. Her face didn't change much. Just her eyes, they flickered, like a curtain being pulled back for a second. Who? You know who. She crossed her arms. Why were you on my laptop? I wasn't. Not on purpose. You left it open. I saw a message. Her jaw tightened. She didn't deny it. Didn't confess, either. Are you? I couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, I didn't plan it. It just happened. That's when I felt it. The shift. That final fracture. There was no shouting. No plates thrown. Just this dull, terrible stillness between us. I sat down on the edge of the couch like I'd forgotten how to hold myself up. How long? I asked. A few months. Is it him? Is he the reason you've been gone every Thursday? Every other night you say you're at yoga or a book club. She hesitated. That told me everything. I didn't mean to fall for him, she said. I didn't mean to fall out of love with you, either. But we lost our son. And I lost myself. And you, she paused, you buried yourself in work. In your family. In fixing everything except me. That was her version of the truth. And maybe there was some truth in it. I had thrown myself into survival mode. I didn't know how else to carry us through the wreckage. I thought if I held steady, she'd find her way back to me. But she hadn't. She'd found someone else instead. I looked at her, really looked, and saw someone I didn't recognize. Her face was the same, but the light behind it was different. Distant. Like she'd already packed up and left, even if her body was still here. Is it serious? I asked. I don't even know why. Maybe I wanted to know how deep the wound was. If it was a scratch or a gut punch. She looked down. I don't know. That stung more than a yes. I nodded. Got up. Walked into the bedroom, packed a bag, and left. Not because I was done, but because I knew I couldn't stay in that apartment and look at her without feeling like I was bleeding out from the inside. I stayed with my cousin Sal that night. He didn't ask questions, just offered me a beer and put on some terrible crime show we used to watch as kids. I sat on his old plaid couch and stared at the screen without seeing anything. Later that night, he finally said, "You want to talk?" I shook my head. Not yet. You know Ma never liked her, he said after a while. Don't, I said, quietly. All right. He didn't bring it up again. The next morning, I woke up with a splitting headache and the vague memory of crying into a throw pillow that smelled like pepperoni. She hadn't called. Hadn't texted. And that, more than anything else, told me exactly where we stood. I moved back in a few days later. Not because we'd worked things out. Not because I forgave her. But because it was still my home too. I didn't want to keep sleeping on Sal's couch, pretending things were fine while his kids whispered behind the hallway door, asking why Uncle Norm was crying in the middle of the night. She wasn't expecting me. When I walked through the door, she looked like she didn't know whether to cry or disappear. Maybe she was hoping I'd stay away. Maybe she was dreading that I wouldn't. I'm not here to play house, I told her. But we need to talk. She nodded. But we didn't talk that day. Or the next. We just kind of circled each other. Made coffee. Washed dishes. Brushed past each other in the hallway like ghosts still haunting the same walls. Her phone never left her side. Every vibration made my stomach turn. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't want to hear lies, and I wasn't ready for the truth. She slept in the bedroom. I took the couch. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the ways we tried to build something solid, how we patched the cracks after our son died, how we tried to smile through pain like it wouldn't come back later to collect. Now the cracks weren't cracks anymore. They were canyons. She never cried. That's what messed with me most. Not once. Not after I confronted her. Not when I left. Not when I came back. She moved like someone who had already mourned what we were. One night, I heard her laughing in the other room. Soft. Private. Like it was meant for someone else. And I thought about how long it had been since she'd laughed like that around me. I wondered if she was texting him. I wondered if he was better than me. Younger. Funnier. Someone who didn't carry the weight of a dead child and a disappointed family and a last name that always felt too heavy. I didn't ask. I didn't want to hear how happy he made her feel. Or how alive she felt around him. Or how she didn't mean to hurt me. I already knew all the things she might say. I'd said them to myself 100 times in the mirror. Instead, I went into the nursery. It was still untouched. Still quiet. The walls were painted sky blue, with tiny white clouds my niece had helped me stencil on. The crib was still set up. The mobile still hung from the ceiling, motionless, gathering dust. I sat down on the floor and let myself break. I talked to him, my son. Our son. Told him how sorry I was. How I didn't know how to keep things from falling apart. How I'd tried so hard to be the strong one, the steady one, the anchor. But even anchors rust. Even anchors snap. She found me in there an hour later, sitting with one of his stuffed animals in my hands. She didn't say anything, just stood in the doorway, like she didn't know what to do with me anymore. We were strangers who knew too much about each other. Who shared a wound too deep to talk about and too raw to touch. After a long silence, she said, "You don't have to stay, you know." I didn't look at her. "Yeah. I know. But you're here. I don't know where else to go." That was the truth. It wasn't just about her. It was about everything. The grief. The betrayal. The guilt. The empty crib and the unused baby blanket and the way every room whispered things we didn't want to hear. We didn't talk again for another 3 days. I started seeing a therapist. I didn't tell her. I just went. At our first session, I sat on the edge of the chair, hands clenched, heart in my throat. The therapist asked me what brought me in. I said, "I think I'm losing my wife." Then I paused. "No. I think I already lost her. I'm just the last one to admit it." I didn't plan to confront her again. Not that night, not in that moment. But sometimes something in you just snaps. Like your body knows before your mind does that you can't carry it anymore. It was late. She was in the kitchen making tea, standing in her robe like she used to on quiet nights when we still held each other for warmth instead of distance. I watched her from the doorway, her back turned, the kettle hissing behind her. I said her name. She turned around, startled. "Yeah. I need to know the truth," I said. She looked at me for a long time. Like she was deciding who to be in that moment, the woman who still lied to protect herself, or the one who finally faced what she'd done. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't pretend. "I slept with him," she said. Just like that. No build-up. No hesitation. And I swear to you, I thought I was prepared. I thought I already knew. But hearing it aloud. It's like your body can't hold itself up under the weight of it. My knees literally buckled, and I had to sit. She didn't rush to me. Didn't try to touch my shoulder or hold my hand or apologize. She just stood there, arms crossed, eyes wet. How long? I asked. Since October. It was March. I did the math in my head. That meant while we were trying to reconnect, while we were in therapy, while we were still sleeping under the same roof and pretending to move forward, she was already gone. Did you love him? She hesitated. I don't know. Did you love me? More silence. And that was my answer. You could have left, I said. You didn't have to stay and lie. I wasn't trying to lie. I was trying to survive, she whispered. You don't know what it's like to feel so alone next to someone who's supposed to love you. You stopped talking to me. You buried yourself in your job, your family. We lost our son. I shouted. Louder than I meant to. It echoed off the kitchen tiles like an accusation. Tears welled up in her eyes. But I didn't care. Not in that moment. I buried myself in whatever I could because I was drowning. And I thought, my voice cracked, I thought you were drowning too. I didn't know you were just swimming away from me. She turned away. Maybe because she couldn't look at me. Or maybe because she didn't want to. I didn't plan to fall into anything with him, she said. It wasn't like that. It was slow. It was emotional first. That almost made it worse. I loved you, I said. Even when it was hard. Even when it was silent. Even when I wasn't sure how to keep going. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe, still facing the wall. I know, she whispered. That's what makes this so awful. And she was right. It wasn't some affair born of lust or thrill. It was something built in the space between two broken people. She found someone who didn't remind her of the baby we lost. Someone who didn't carry the weight of family rejection or quiet guilt. Someone new. Clean. Simple. And me? I stayed. I stayed and waited for her to come back, never realizing she'd already left. After a long silence, she said, I haven't seen him in a few weeks. I didn't respond. I didn't care if she'd ended it or if she was just saying what she thought I wanted to hear. Because the damage was already done. I don't know what to do, she said, voice small. I don't know who I am anymore. And I believed her. But I also knew something else, maybe for the first time with real clarity. I didn't have to lose myself just because she had. I stood up. Walked out of the kitchen. She didn't follow me. She didn't have to. I didn't leave right away. Not because I was staying for her, but because I was staying for me. Because for the first time in months, maybe longer, I wasn't trying to win her back or prove anything to anyone. I was just, waiting to feel something solid under my feet again. I moved my stuff into the guest room. She offered to leave, or sleep on the couch, but I didn't want the theater of it. I told her, we can coexist. For now. We weren't fighting anymore. That's the part one didn't expect. There were no more explosions. Just silence. The kind that comes after a storm, when everything's wet and ruined but still standing. I went to work. Came home. Cooked for myself. Cleaned my own dishes. Sometimes we crossed paths in the kitchen. Other times we went whole days without speaking. I told my therapist everything. About the affair. About the baby. About how I felt like I'd been sleepwalking through grief and just woke up in the middle of a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. He asked me something I didn't expect, if she had never cheated, would you still be happy in that marriage? I didn't answer right away. Because the truth? I didn't know. I'd spent so long trying to hold everything together, I never asked myself if it was even worth holding. Love had turned into endurance. There were days when I looked at her and still saw the girl from the music festival. The woman who danced in our kitchen, who whispered, I love you, in the dark. But more often, I saw someone tired. Distant. Lost. And maybe that's how she saw me too. One evening, she came into the guest room. Didn't knock. Just stood in the doorway with that look like she was bracing for rejection. "I talked to my mom," she said. "I think I'm going to stay with them for a while." I just nodded. Not because I wanted her to go. Not because I wanted her to stay. Because for the first time, it wasn't about what I wanted. It was about what was real. She sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment we were quiet, like old friends who didn't know how to say goodbye. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for him. For all of it. For not showing up. For leaving you alone in all that grief." I stared at the floor. We both left each other. We just did it in different ways. "I still love you," she said. "But I don't know if it's the kind that stays." That broke me more than anything else. Because it was honest. Because it sounded like something I could have said. I nodded again. "Yeah. I think I understand." She moved out 2 days later. Took her things quietly. Gave me space. There were no tears, no begging, no second-guessing. Just a soft goodbye, and the sound of the door closing behind her. And I stood there in the hallway for a long time after she left, listening to the silence. It was different now. Not empty. Just quiet. I started putting things away the next morning. Donating what we didn't need. Clearing out the nursery. I folded the blanket, wrapped it in tissue paper, and stored it in a small wooden box. Not because I was forgetting, but because I was letting go of the weight. I called my mom, told her everything. She didn't say, "I told you so," though I could hear it forming in her throat. Instead, she said, "Come by Sunday. We'll cook." I almost cried. Not because I missed her, but because I missed being someone's son more than I realized. Missed being taken care of, just for a moment. Grief, betrayal, distance, none of it disappears overnight. But something strange happens when you stop trying to fix what's broken. You make room for something new. Not someone new. Just, something. Even if it's just a full night's sleep. Or cooking pasta for one. Or waking up without dread in your chest. It's not healing. Not yet. But maybe it's the beginning of it. The apartment felt bigger without her. Not better. Not worse. Just bigger. Like space had returned to places I didn't realize had been crowded. The couch, the kitchen, the bathroom sink, quiet now, untouched. Even the coat rack looked like it was missing something. I didn't fill it with noise. I didn't throw parties or play music late or invite people over. I just existed. Ate alone. Slept alone. Folded laundry in silence. And in that silence, I started to notice myself again. That first weekend, I went to my parents' house for Sunday dinner. I hadn't done that in months. My mom hugged me tight, longer than usual, and didn't say anything. That was her way of showing love without gloating. My dad gave me a beer and said, "You're still young. You'll figure it out." I didn't believe him. But I appreciated the lie. My uncles didn't bring her up. My cousins didn't whisper. Even my sister, who'd always been on the fence about her, looked at me like I'd finally come home from something no one wanted to name. But grief isn't something you leave behind. You carry it. Like a pocket stone. Sometimes it's light, smooth. Sometimes it cuts. I still caught myself reaching for her in the middle of the night. Still caught myself setting out 2 mugs instead of 1. And the nursery? I kept the door closed most days. Not because I wanted to forget, but because I didn't want to fall in again. That room was a time capsule. A dream sealed shut. Sometimes I'd crack the door just enough to let light in. I'd stand there for a few seconds, holding my breath, like I was waiting to hear a cry that never came. One afternoon, I got a letter. Not a text. Not an email. A real, handwritten letter. From her. She said she was in Massachusetts, staying with her mom. Said she was going to start working again soon. She was seeing a counselor. Not the kind we saw together. Someone new. She didn't ask for me back. She didn't even apologize again. She just wrote. Said she hoped I was eating. That I was sleeping more. That maybe one day I'd pick up my guitar again. That if I ever did, she hoped I'd still remember that silly little song I used to make up when we were too broke for cable and spent nights serenading each other with nonsense lyrics and candlelight. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box with our son's blanket. Didn't cry. Didn't smile. Just sat with it. People talk a lot about forgiveness like it's some grand event. Like a speech you give or a moment you feel lighter. But I think it's quieter than that. It's in the choice not to hate. It's in letting the anger pass through you without setting up camp. It's in walking into your home and not seeing ghosts in every corner. That week, I started packing up the nursery. Not all of it. Just the things that felt like anchors. We weren't having another child. Not together. Maybe not ever. But that didn't mean I had to let that room become a shrine to pain. I left the clouds on the wall. Took down the crib. Folded the baby clothes into a box and labeled it simply, his things. Not gone. Not lost. Just his. Because he existed. For us. For a moment. And maybe that moment was enough to change us, even if it wasn't enough to hold us together. I didn't reach out to her after that letter. I didn't need to. She was doing what she needed to do. And for the first time in a long time, so was I. It's strange, the things you miss. Not the big stuff. Not the anniversaries or the vacations or the nights tangled in bedsheets. You expect to miss those. You brace for them. But the real pain shows up in the details. The way she used to hum when she poured her morning tea. The sound of the shower running at the same time every night. The grocery list on the fridge in her handwriting, full of things I never ate but bought anyway. I even missed the arguments sometimes, because at least back then, we still cared enough to fight. Now the house is quiet. Still. A little cleaner. A little emptier. I kept the guitar out. Finally dusted it off and tuned it again. Haven't written anything new, but I've been playing. Old stuff. Familiar chords. Things that remind me who I was before I started bending in half to hold something together that didn't want to be held. It's not that I don't love her anymore. I do. It's just different now. Softer. Like the love you might have for someone in an old photograph. Someone who meant everything once but doesn't belong to the present version of you. Sometimes I think love and grief are made of the same stuff. Same shape. Just turned inside out. I went to visit my son's resting place last weekend. First time in a long time I didn't feel like I needed to bring something, no flowers, no balloon, no folded note. I just sat there on the bench beside the headstone. Let the wind carry whatever it needed to. Let myself feel sad without guilt. I told him about the guitar. About his mom, too. I didn't say bad things. Just honest ones. Told him she's healing in her way, and I'm healing in mine. That he was loved, deeply, and still is. I think if he were here, if he'd grown up, maybe one day I'd have told him all of this. About how messy life can get. How people break sometimes, not out of cruelty, but out of hurt. How forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. And how strength isn't about holding on, it's knowing when to let go with grace. I think he would have understood. I still see her face sometimes, in dreams or old photos I can't quite bring myself to delete. There's no anger anymore. No fire in my chest when I think of her with someone else. Just, quiet. I ran into her sister a few days ago. We talked for a bit. She said my ex is doing okay, working again, seeing a therapist still. Said she asks about me sometimes. Wants to know if I'm alright. Tell her I'm okay, I said. And I meant it. Not perfect. Not fixed. But okay. I've started cooking again. For myself this time. Learning new things. Went back to Sunday dinners with the family, and I don't flinch anymore when they bring up her name. She was part of my life. And a part of me still hopes she finds peace. That she finds someone who brings her back to herself in the right way. That I do too. A friend asked me recently if I'd ever date again. I said, yeah. One day. Not today. But one day. And that's enough for now. Because the truth is, some wounds don't heal clean. They scar. And maybe that's the point. Maybe we carry those scars not as shame, but as proof we lived, we loved, we lost, and we kept going. So yeah. That's where I'm at. I'm still here. And I'm still becoming whoever I'm meant to be next.